All right. So, hello, Michelle. Thanks for coming
Hello.
back on my channel. Hello, puppy in the background.
Yeah, he's back there. That's Cody.
Kobe.
Cody
Oh,
with a D.
Cody.
Cody.
Hello,
Yeah.
Cody. So, we're going to talk about your essay today that you recently wrote, and I'm just curious. You've always been. This is my take. You've always been you always try to be very logical and cautious, and not, you know, jump into groups. And I think, and you talk about that a little bit in the essay, that you came out of the whole trans activism culty type thing where everybody had to walk a very strict line. If you stepped out, you'd be like ostracized or kicked out and everything. So you didn't care for that kind of thinking. Um,
Mhm.
so just tell me a little bit about, like, kind of how your philosophy was coming out of the trans stuff, and, like, what's your thought process around how you move through life now and make these decisions on what you believe or don't believe.
I guess coming out of it, it was because there was so much like cultiness happening in there. And when I say cultiness, people might be all like, well, it's not a cult if there's not like um the one leader. There's usually people say like in order to have a cult, there needs to be like a physical one leader person. So we can say a high demand group is like one of the other like soft terms that people use for it. High demand group or unhealthy relationship dynamics in like a group dynamic. At any rate, it was abusive behavior happening between activists essentially. Um, and it was rarely against, I mean, it's often against people that they don't like, but it just seems like people are so much madder at people who are supposed to be allies. And I think I said this in the article. I see that a lot in the even just the gender critical or whatever they call it now. Anti-gender movement is what the leftists call it, or what Wikipedia calls it anyway.
Okay.
I prefer to say I'm anti-transition. I think that's what is specific to me. Um, but anyway, so I came out of it. Part of it was the way that I got out of it was before I detransitioned, I was reading a lot of leftists who were critiquing leftism, or at least they were critiquing the behavior. And I was like, you're right. This behavior is wrong. This behavior is causing, it's almost traumatic the way that you can lose everything. You can lose all your friends and everyone, you can be canceled. Everyone will just leave you and there's nothing you can do about it. And as soon as someone decides that you're a bad person, everything, they interpret everything that you do in bad faith from that point forward. So I came out of that being like, I don't want to be part of something like that again. So I took like 6 months off and then I joined Twitter again because I needed to talk about uh, what was going on with me and just detransitioning and transition recovery and just that whole process. Um, and I have been really careful since coming into it to not really identify myself with specific people, although I have been in groups, I have been part of organizations since then. I'm currently not part of any organizations. I left them all. So,
I feel you.
yeah. Um, it's hard. Well, they were moderate groups, both of them. There are two specific ones, and I don't want to. One of them, I was never like, what's the word? I was never really publicly part of one of them, so I don't really want to say what it was. But the other one was GenSpect. So, and I was on the website for 18 months ish as like one of their team members. So I think I'm allowed to say I was part of GenSpect, and that was one of the moderate groups that I ended up leaving. Um, so what I found was that in a lot of these groups, and I don't want, this isn't like specific to GenSpect, but I find just in trying to be moderate in general, you're making compromises. And like that's what being moderate is making compromises. And where I'm at now is that I've come to this conclusion that the compromises that I was making were personally damaging to me. And I think that actually they're damaging to society. So now I don't want to make those compromises anymore. And I know that there are a lot of people who that was already their line, that they wouldn't compromise on certain things. So, for example, they wouldn't compromise on pronouns or they wouldn't compromise on transition ever being right for anyone, or they wouldn't compromise on people who are still trans identified being in the movement and being quote unquote role models. And I've changed on some of those things now. So that's sort of where I've come to, is that being in spaces where people are telling me, a lot of these places they focus on pediatric transition. So that's the whole problem, is that I never wanted to focus on pediatric transition. That's just it's the easiest position to take, is if you're under 18, you shouldn't be doing it ever. Um, because that makes sense. Of course it does. But since I've come into it, the entire time I've thought there is something happening to the adults too. Like this isn't proper. This isn't right. So I've had that position the whole time, and I constantly have people coming up to me, or not coming up to me necessarily in person, but like just on Twitter being like, well, you were over 18, so this and this and this, or adults can do what they want. We should leave the kids alone. Adults can do what they want. Like that is the line, leave the kids alone. And I'm saying, leave the vulnerable adults alone too. So, people don't want to, a lot of people don't want to compromise with me on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become a hard line for me now.
Yeah.
It's a hard line.
Well, I always found that line the whole adults can do what they want. I've talked about it a lot, how I don't think that it's a bullshit kind of idea, because if this wasn't a treatment that's being prescribed to people and carried out by doctors as a legitimate treatment for a mental or emotional health issue, then sure, adults can do what they want, but this is not, I mean, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? They're saying on one hand, it's this choice that an adult makes, and on the other hand, it's a life-saving treatment. Mm-hmm. Well, which is it, And or it's not a mental health condition, yet you're treating something. You have to go to a mental health professional to get diagnosed, supposedly, to get treated. And the treatment is this very invasive, damaging medicalization of the body.
Yeah.
And so since when do adults walk into a doctor and tell that doctor their diagnosis and what they want the doctor to do to them, and that doctor does it? That's what's happening with trans care.
Exactly.
Now,
yep.
Is that ethical care? I would say absolutely not. That's not ethical care. And that's the problem here. If it was not a treatment being prescribed to everybody, then yeah, you could say adults can choose. If adults were just going out and going to a cosmetic surgeon and paying out of pocket to alter their bodies like thousands or probably more adults do all the time, have at it. But that's not what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, because I think a lot of, I don't want to like try and pick a demographic, but I think a lot of people that transition are poor. Like, I think there is a lot of people that are already vulnerable. Just out of like a random example, there's I don't know if he's a psychiatrist or psychologist, but he's some kind of mental health professional in British Columbia in Canada, who has had something like 1,000 gender distressed children come through his office, and something like half of them are Indigenous, which is that's a vulnerable population. You got to start asking questions. Why is that happening? And I think people who are vulnerable, I think we sort of start leaning on this idea that there's usually you're vulnerable for reasons that are really, really complicated. Just mental health in general is really complicated. And the idea that you can do one thing and it will fix everything, that you found the one thing that's wrong with you and that it'll fix everything, I think it's just really, really tempting to people who are super vulnerable. And where I was going with the fact that a lot of these people are poor is the fact that, for example, I would have never had a hysterectomy if it wasn't paid for by insurance, because I wouldn't have been able to pay for it. So it would have stopped me and I would have dealt with it. Like it wasn't life-saving, it wasn't necessary, but I didn't
Yeah.
realize that at the time, but the doctors should have realized it.
Yeah. So in your article here, I wanted to pull some like quotes from it and then like discuss it. But man, as I'm going through it, I'm like the whole thing is just fucking great. Like I'm just pulling too many quotes. So I'll try to keep it, somewhat in check. So kind of first, you say if your goal is to reach the left on the topic of sex trait modification. Sex trait modification, have you always used that, or is that something new you're kind of using now?
I think I might have pulled this one from Lior Sapir. He says pediatric sex trait modification referred to like childhood transition. And I think you just take off pediatric and sex trait modification is the replacement. I am currently writing my book and I have rewritten a lot of it to take out the word transition and replace it with sex trait modification. And when talking about social transition, I use the word sex deception instead.
I like it. I like it. I was like, yeah, it's a better way of putting that.
Mhm.
Um, then using identity, so topic of sex trade modification, then using identity politics to your advantage might be a decent strategy. Okay, so you're talking about how a lot of the lefties who are trying to win over the other lefties um, have leaned into using the transsexuals that are against the childhood transition and are trying to fight the good fight, and they're the real true transsexuals, and they think that bringing them on board is going to give them some credence. And I mean, I've said from the beginning, it's not. People, you don't understand how the trans community works. The minute even if a trans person steps out of line, they are now done. No one is going to listen to them. You've given no credence to anything. So, like, what's your point? I guess they could say they're trying to reach the middle of the road Democrats or liberals or whatever. But um, yeah. So discuss a little bit about your ideas around this topic.
Yeah, when I like it's coming from my own like lived experience. That's what the whole thing is. Well, um, sorry, my brain is going really fast right now. We both have ADHD. Um, uh, so it's this idea of, I guess, using lived experience. So you have the people with the lived experience, so transsexuals in this case, and I don't like the word transsexual, but I am going to use it just because I think it often sort of I use it to like distinguish from just trans people who because most of the transsexuals don't think they're transgender. They think that they are the true ones who have a real medical condition, what we used to call true scum way back in the day.
Yeah.
Twitter. So I took a long break from social media when I detransitioned. And then when I came back, I started talking about my detransition. And then I tried to start talking about it. I was talking about it on Twitter, and then I tried to start talking about it on Facebook. So that Facebook is where I know all the people, where all my friends were, and I hadn't really, I hadn't really been saying very much. I think I posted a few memes. Almost none of them got any like likes or reactions at all. They were just ignoring me and pretending that I wasn't doing anything. And then I posted something about there was the conversion therapy bill in Canada that was going through saying that there's such thing as conversion therapy for gender identity. And I posted saying I'm concerned that this is going to prevent therapists from doing exploratory therapy, the kind of thing that I would have liked instead of being like transitioned. And then I had people calling me a Nazi, and it just sort of went and got bad from there. But during that time, I tried to use the fact that I knew people who were trans identified, transsexuals, that were not happy with this and who also agreed with me, who also thought we can't ban conversion therapy for gender identity because that makes no sense. And so I tried to like leverage that. And if you say basically what happened was if you say I know trans people who also agree with me, they'll just go I know trans people who agree with me. Doesn't mean anything. It doesn't it doesn't help at all. And if you talk to other trans people, they'll just say, oh well, those people have internalized transphobia, or they're self-loathing, they're pick-me's.
Mhm.
there's no credibility whatsoever. So we're trying to use them, but it's not working. I
Yeah.
don't think we're actually reaching anyone with them.
No.
So
So
that's where
so
it started.
okay, so you learned from that experience that that doesn't work. And I came out of the same kind of, probably not as quite as involved in activism as you were, but I came out of the same kind of, trans cult kind of mindset where, yeah, I mean, I gosh, before I detransition, I remember I had just asked a question about something, uh, and I got a whole bunch of flacks, basically just asking the question to clarify what the other side was talking about or why the other side did something. That's all I just wanted to know, because they weren't telling news and everything and all the trans activists and everything. They were just calling them transphobes. Transphobes did this thing. Why? Like, what are they mad about? Like, I wanted to know what the other side was mad about. It doesn't matter, they're transphobes. But it does matter, So it's like, and already I then, they turn on you, right? And then they're starting to question you because you're questioning it. So yeah, it's
Mm.
like it's not gonna go anywhere with those types. A lot of these transsexuals, that are active in the GC movement or whatever, will say things like, you have to have gender dysphoria. Okay, we all, like, how many of us did or do have it? Like, if you were to categorize me and stuck me in therapy as a young teenager, I would have been probably diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I had issues my whole life with it, right? No different. And you bring that up too. So many detransitioners are no different than the people still living as trans,
Yeah.
you know? And then you say, let's see. These are primary people who satisfy with their own treatment. Okay, so the people they're satisfied with the treatment, but believe that medical professionals needed to readopt the restrictions that once existed, particularly for people under the age of 18. They also tended to emphasize gender dysphoria as a medical condition in need of treatment rather than mainstream emphasis on gender identity and natural human variation. So the problem I find with this is I hear a lot of these transsexuals talking about how the old way was good and true, and but it
I didn't even
wasn't.
mention it, but it wasn't. You're right.
It
I,
wasn't.
I can't fit everything in there,
I
but
know.
I say they want to adopt the restrictions that previously exist, but I could have put the word allegedly in there, allegedly existed, because I think I read an article back from like 2004 about people who regretted transition, and there was a man who, I think was a man anyway, who had surgery after a 45-minute therapy appointment. Like that's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Like this was happening the whole time. There were always people that you could get around it somehow. And I was one of those people in 2010. So that's 14 years ago. In 2010, I was referred. If you knew people, they could get you in. So that
Mhm.
was what happened was I was in a support group. The support group was run by activists. One of them is like one of the transgender pioneers of Canada, Rupert Raj. I have no problem mentioning his name because we can't find, sorry, her. We can't find her. Um, and we think she's not in Canada anymore. So she was never served. So with my statement of claim. So even though we tried to sue her, but we could not find her.
Ooh.
But anyway, I have no problem mentioning that because there's no other way that I'm going to get justice for that one. So she's the one that wrote my letter saying that I was an ideal candidate. Um, and another therapist wrote another letter. So I needed two letters at that time. This was WPATH Standards of Care 6. Um, but the people I was referred to, the doctors that I was referred to, they were still not following the WPATH standards, even though the WPATH standards are bullshit. But like, they
Well,
weren't even following them.
that's the other thing people don't get. WPATH doesn't have any teeth. They don't do anything. They're a group of people. They've always been a group of activists. Always been a group of activists. Going all the way back to Harry Benjamin, who was just some fucking dude who liked to give hormones to people, right?
Mhm.
So it's always been an activist group of people who wanted to modify their bodies and have it legitimate. Basically,
Yes.
they wanted to basically make it okay for them to cut parts of their body off and take cross-sex hormones. You know,
Mhm.
um, so it's like the WPATH has never been anything. and they don't have the teeth to actually in order to regulate and to make sure your standards of care are followed, there has to be some kind of punishment if it's not, right? You have to have
Right.
oversight. There's no oversight happening.
That's the whole thing, is that okay, for example, in Canada, and I know all these things because I do like, I'm a transcriptionist and I get like disciplinary hearings, for example. So like regulated health professionals. Chiropractors have a regulatory body, even though chiropractics is it's not, I don't want to say supposedly, but it is technically pseudoscience. There's no science backing it up, but they have a regulatory body. And if you do it the wrong way, you have a disciplinary hearing, you get in trouble, you lose your ability to practice. And there is nothing like that for anything to do with trans, nothing. So like massage therapists have things like that. There's just every single health professional all have things like that. And if you are a gender specialist, there's nothing,
Yeah,
because there's no real standards. The standards of care that exist, they're not standards of care. They're actually just guidelines. So
exactly. And it's always been that way. It's always been
mhm,
that way. So when these true transsexuals and other people like to talk about how there was these good old days where everything was legit and everything, they're full of shit. There wasn't,
there wasn't.
it was very Wild West. It's always been, you
Hmm.
know. Yeah, you might have run across a therapist that was because from their own ethics doing a good job, you know. But you could easily run across 10 that weren't. So,
Yes. Yeah. So the way I got in was I got in through an activist. An activist referred me to another clinic, and that clinic was doing. It was an activist clinic, you know. It's like
mhm.
you walk in the door, and there was like a big poster the entire time I was there. So this is in 2010. There's a poster on the wall telling trans men to get pap smears, for example, which is, a good campaign, but you can tell that they are social justice minded because of
Yeah.
stuff like that. Not just that, there were other advertisements in there that suggested that same thing. So they were putting themselves forward as sort of like a progressive type of clinic. And these same clinics do stuff like safe injection sites and other things that seem to be pushed by left policies that don't really meet like healthcare standards, things like that. But let's not get into
Yeah.
that one. But they're similar in that way.
So, I like here that you addressed your change of mind,
Mhm.
right? And I think I appreciate that, and I like people who can take in new information and change their mind if they think that's an appropriate thing to do. I've done that myself over the years. Um, so you say that 2 years ago, I wrote a blog post during which, in part, I defended transsexuals in the movement, describe the concerns people had, blah, blah, blah. You talk about that. And then you say, I no longer have reservations about these concerns. I now agree that being an out transsexual is promoting an unhealthy lifestyle. So what kind of I don't know, what flipped that for you? What made you start to really question that and go, huh? I mean, you say kind of in here that it's more just about you ran across a lot of them and went, they ain't right.
Yeah. Like, so are you asking sort of like how came to the conclusion actually they're unhealthy, or sort of why I came to the conclusion they're not good role models? Like
Yes, I guess
or a
both.
little bit
What
both.
what prompted your change of mind, basically? That yeah,
Yeah, and I did say in there that part of it was meeting people and then sort
yeah,
of realizing that even though they kind of put on the front that everything's fine, there's some behind the scenes stuff that goes on, that, their relationships are falling apart sometimes, or they have health issues that they're not being like completely forward about. Or there's just other like societal things that are clearly upsetting them, but they're just not really talking about it. They're not really like, I feel like there's just a lot of denial, essentially.
yeah.
Is that I think I just saw a lot of denial happening.
But like
And yeah,
that makes sense because if you strip away everything else, it's a lie.
yeah,
It's just a lie. And how is it ever healthy or okay or good to live lying to yourself and other people around you? It's not honest. And our society is, in my opinion, big picture here, our society has just gone off the rails with the whole every person has their own idea of right and wrong. It's like, well, no, sometimes there are there are facts and not facts, and sometimes I think there are rights and wrongs. Um,
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance. So, for example, I, throughout this, I'm not going to name anybody by name.
yeah,
Just, just for record, I'm not
uh,
going to say anybody. But for example, there would be like someone who would say, um, actually, if I could do this all over, maybe I wouldn't have transitioned, but I'm happy with my choices now. And then, like it'll be sort of like maybe I wouldn't have done it, but actually, I'm happy with all my choices. And I'm like, are you happy with your choices if you would have done it differently? Kind of thing. I feel like they're halfway there and they don't want to go all the way there because they realize that means that they have to make a massive change in their life.
yeah.
Um, yeah. So it's just sort of, I can see the cognitive dissonance happening and I know what it's like to have cognitive dissonance. So, um, I
So,
have, I
do
have
you?
empathy. So,
No, absolutely. Like I think one of the things that made me so mad coming out of this, and the reason I've been a pain in the ass, is because I knew so many trans identified people when I was trans identified who were just as hurt and fucked up as I was and needed help and were just being failed by the system that is supposed to, um, you know, help gatekeep. I don't really like gatekeep, but just basically try to figure out what the best path is for somebody who is obviously not in a right place, because that's the whole point of mental health, right? Is to
mhm.
help humans that are not all there for whatever reason, struggling, um, to find their way out. They're in a dark place. You try to help them find their way out. Something that is. I mean, I used to think that therapy's primary goal was to help re-engage people with reality and um, live accepting the realities of your world and truth and learn how to deal with that. Because I think so much of mental and emotional stress comes from running away from reality or wanting to change something you can't change.
Mhm.
Like that's like radical acceptance is such a refreshing thing to practice, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it honestly it reminds me of something my one of my therapists told me was like this sort of focus on I focused a lot on like how things should be. You
Yeah.
know, like I should have done this or I should be like this or I should this and she would say, you got to take the word should out of your vocabulary. It's like it's ruining. It's going to just make your health worse because, you can't talk about what should be. You can only talk about what is. So it's very radical acceptance, but also this
Mhm.
same therapist did not question my gender identity when I was like, I'm a man. So,
Yeah, the divorce from the two thought processes are just amazing sometimes. So in here you talk about that your intention is not to force anyone to detransition. Well, you can't anyways. Like that's.
yep,
But I like how you put that. But this is still my opinion, and this is still what I've seen, and I have a right to say that this is the case. And I like that because it's like, I think the more information, the more perspectives out there, the better choice everybody can make. Let's talk about sex trait modification as a coping mechanism.
yeah.
What's tell me what your view is on that.
Um, I think. Well, I mean, I have been referring to it as like a coping mechanism the entire time,
Hmm.
and I think part of what happened because we are talking about what made me change my mind, and part of the reason that I flipped on it, I think, was I think I originally approached it as this is a coping mechanism, but maybe it is the right coping mechanism for some people, and
Ah,
I think personal opinion, there are always going to be people that say, yeah, it is the right coping mechanism for me, and what am I going to say to that? I can just say, okay, you live your life. Um, but as I got to know people better and the more detransitioners that I talked to as well, is sort of made me realize that it is always an unhealthy coping mechanism kind of thing. And in my head, I keep like sort of comparing it to like smoking weed because I used to use smoking pot all the time as a coping mechanism. I still do, sober right now, but that is one of the things that I would always just sort of fall back on. And I know so many people who say, well, marijuana is medicine for me and I can't survive without it. And they'll say the same thing about antidepressants also. And I don't think it's true for either of them. I think no one should be reliant on like an external substance in order to get through the day. I think people are replacing real skills with these coping mechanisms. And I think also that's what's happening with transition. So I thought about that and I thought about it's the same thing. You're replacing real skills with something that is just helping you cope and maybe should have, well, not with transition, but maybe should have been something temporary. Transition can't be temporary.
Yeah.
It's irreversible. So they like, if they needed a coping mechanism, it should have been like a temporary one. Like, even if we're going to say if someone's going to say it's a treatment down the road, then this needs to be a last resort type of thing.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's that, and
well, I like the comparison you did with the functioning alcoholic. I felt like that was the best comparison, and the reason, and I the other thing when I read that, I was like, there it is, because I remember when it first got in this whole trans detrans debate, and I felt it was a unhealthy coping mechanism that people were doing, and it was never healthy to do it. I remember I had a good friend back in when I was a teenager whose father was a raging alcoholic, but a functioning alcoholic, to the point where if the man didn't drink, he became unfunctioning. He became mean. He became hostile, but he was the nicest guy, just like the greatest dad and everything when he was drinking. And I saw so many, like, it's like, okay, but no one is going to say what he's doing is okay. No one is going to say, he's not going to go to the doctor and get a jug of whiskey every week. No one is okaying this because it is self-destructive. He is harming his body, and he is taking a lot of resources from his family. I'm sure he did for all those booze. There's just a lot of things happening there that I think just parallel so well with transition.
Yeah. What was interesting is that I read a lot of the Twitter replies that I was getting to my article, that like other people would post it, and then I would read those replies also just to see like how it's being received. And so I have two examples. One of them is from someone who I believe is trans identified, is a TRA. And they said something like, I was an alcoholic for however many years, and then described how terrible their life was while they were an addict. And then at the end sort of summarized, I know what being addicted to something was like, and my transition is not an addiction, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, well, you were a low functioning addict before, and now you're a high functioning one.
Well, also,
and then so I was going to say, I was compare it to someone else who responded to someone who was on more of a gender critical side. And this person said, I was a meth addict. I had a family and 2 to 3 jobs to support this addict, support this addiction. And this analogy is perfect. It's the same thing. So here's another addict saying, actually, it is the same thing. So I do think that even though some people don't think it's a good analogy, there are clearly people who have a lived experience of being addicted to a different substance who do think it's a good analogy. So,
well, maybe it's not. Maybe if you're focusing just on the addictive quality, or maybe that's not the greatest. But I look at addiction as addiction is a coping mechanism. Addiction is masking. Addiction is helping the person in some way. And the addiction can be gambling or shopping or eating or drinking or modifying your body. There's lots of things people get into to cope and relieve what stress, anxiety, or whatever's happening with them.
they're also,
so that's why it's the same.
You can also be addicted to not eating.
Yes.
Addicted to self-harming.
Self-harm, yeah. And self-harm isn't just one thing. Self-harm in a person who is self-destructive finds all kinds of very sneaky ways to hurt themselves without admitting they're hurting themselves. I mean, just from my own personal experience, that was exactly what I did. My whole adult life was marked by situations of me doing some really stupid shit and almost killing myself, hurting myself in some way. Um, and transition was just another form of that. Also, I'd like to point out that when it comes to addiction or eating disorders or whatever you want to call them, different, coping mechanisms that are harmful, people do often switch from one to another. So, like,
Yes.
for example, I've known a few women who've had eating disorder issues, and they'll swap out eating disorder for alcoholism. They'll eat when they're drinking,
Mm.
you know. And so it's one of those things where it's like, well, that happens, right? People swap out shit all the time. I also had a friend who was a meth addict for a few years, and when she stopped meth, she really got into running marathons. Now, I'm not saying that it can get bad, but I mean, she seems to be okay with it. But she needed something else to kind of go with her kind of, addictive drive of whatever she was searching for, and so she found that. And I guess that's a healthier way to do something. But
Yeah.
yeah,
There are healthy coping mechanisms, and that's one of them.
there are. And the only thing I will say is I do disagree with you a little bit on medication. I do think for some people, medication is needed and can be very life changing. I know it was for me. And no, I can't function off medication. But what am I going to do?
Yeah.
There's only so much that honestly, there's only so much that therapy can do. It just depends on the person. Some people are responsive to it, and it works, and some people just no, it just doesn't.
That's fair.
So
I'm just it I think for me, I was on antidepressants for 10 years, probably more than 10 years. So I just feel like that's too long to be on antidepressants and to not have built any skills in that time frame,
well,
you
no,
know?
that is true. There is some wiggle room there, right? Like I do think that meds are overprescribed.
Yeah.
Definitely. I also think that people can't just pop a pill and think everything's going to be okay. Because that's not the way it works. I mean, you have to work on your shit and the way you manage your life. But they can definitely be an aid. And I don't know. For me, it was kind of life changing. Like the antidepressant was kind of the little bit of a switch that really helped me go into the detransition part. So you know,
Hmm.
it is what it is.
I remember writing something really early, and I can't remember if it was on or off. I think it was because I believe I started antidepressants for the first time in like October, November of 2009. And then I quote unquote came out right at the end, December 2009, going into 2010. And I remember there's a journal entry I have somewhere where I said, when I'm on antidepressants, I think it's when I'm on. I can't remember if it was on or off. When I'm on antidepressants, I don't want to transition anymore.
Yeah.
And that was a really weird thing to sort of reread later on, just being all like, it's almost like there's a part of me underneath it that knew that I didn't have to do it, but I was just, there's no other word for it. I was brainwashed into believing that it was the only thing I could do, or I was going to be miserable forever.
Yeah. Same.
So,
Same. Have you
but
gotten any flack from this?
from TRAs, yeah.
Or from the GC transsexuals?
None
And we
of
all
them
know who
have,
they are.
yeah, none of them have come to me personally. None of them that haven't. A couple of them reblogged my thing. The ones that I have respect for actually reblogged it, and I was like, well, this is why I have respect for you. Um, and the ones they weren't the ones that I was thinking of when I wrote this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So
and both the ones that I'm thinking of also have complicated relationships with their transitions anyway, so they're not really happy transsexuals anyway. And that's who I'm talking about, are the people that are going just in anywhere publicly and being like, transition worked for me, or transition was the right thing for me, and these aren't people who are really doing that. So,
yeah. No,
yeah.
that's the thing too that like just drives me up the walls. And you talk about it here that what are we supposed to do with this like I always felt this way as like a detransitioner. I'm telling my story. If everybody's hearing my story, my story is like basically the same fucking thing as like some other transsexual that says they're happy, like the same thing. But like people aren't putting this together, and it's just so frustrating. So
Mm-hmm.
like the transsexual who boasts that that medicalization worked for them are essentially high functioning addicts. Okay, but they're the boasting part and the talking about it constantly and saying it worked for them. Um, for you, where talk about that disconnect a little bit, and then because you talked about how kids kids see this, like you can't say something's okay, well, hence your title, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do as I say, not as I do. That's what they're doing. And how are you going to say that this is something kids shouldn't do and that this is so damaging and blah blah blah, but when you're 18, oh, it's all great.
Yeah, and I think I said something like, it's like telling kids not to do drugs while doing crack, you
Yeah,
know,
it's
or
this it's exactly the same thing.
you could be like on screen smoking, and smoking, it quote unquote looks cool, and if you're on screen smoking, telling kids not to smoke, it's not really going to do anything. But in this case, it's even worse because they're saying it saved my life. Not all of them are saying it saved my life, but like I need it to live.
Yeah.
But you don't need it to live until you're 18. It doesn't make sense. It
People
doesn't
don't
make
believe this, but it was easier to transition than actually deal with my problems.
yes.
People find that amazing, but that's the absolute truth.
Same. I mean, that's why I wasn't dealing with my problems. For 10 years, it was focus on the transition. What's the next step? And like I had periods of time where there was no next step because I had the bilateral mastectomy in 2012, and then I didn't have another surgery until 2018. So in that whole time, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it the whole time. Um, it was a hysterectomy. I don't think I mentioned this, but it was a hysterectomy in 2018. And the reason I got the hysterectomy is only because I went off of testosterone. When
Mm.
you come off, then my period came back, and then I still thought I was trans. I was identifying as non-binary instead. Um, so in my head, not a woman, but I'm having a period every month, and I still have to go and get pap smears, for example, which I are they were just fucking horrible, just terrible, terrible, terrible. Um, and so I went off in 2016, and in 2017, so like a year later, I was like, I want a hysterectomy, and so they did it.
You
Um,
talked about that a lot of these true trans or these GC trans or whatever are being manipulative and are still they're narcissistic too, probably, and you're
mhm.
and I just found that really interesting because it's like, I mean, not surprised.
I have someone in mind. That's all.
Yeah.
It's
But
just I made the
but
mistake of trusting someone that I should not have trusted, that everyone told me not to trust. So
mm,
that's one of the things that caused this to happen. Was that I trusted someone that everyone said don't trust him, and I did anyway, and it backfired on me. And so you were all right. Congrats. I never trust an AGP. So,
girl.
um,
So if it says if someone says use whatever pronouns you like, they will often get their preferred pronouns.
mhm.
I respect her pronouns because she gave me a choice. No, you got manipulated. He knew exactly what he was doing. I've loved that part because I'm like,
Yep.
I think that's the case. And I mean, I've said this forever. Even the GCs, it's about validation. It ultimately is about validation, right? You are so trans. What you did is so correct that even the people who hate trans love you. Like,
Mhm.
oh, validation. Um, and also I think not just the validation, but I think it quells their own feelings of knowing that they are being dishonest, knowing that they probably did the wrong thing, knowing that what they're doing isn't healthy or good, right? Because I do think you constantly are having to convince yourself that it's okay to do this.
Yeah. And I think they're also trying to convince themselves that they are living in reality when they're not. So, like,
Yeah.
very like repeatedly saying, "Oh, I know I'm male, I know I'm female, but etc." They'll say that, and again, it's both sides of your mouth kind of thing, where I know that I'm male, but also call me by this traditionally female name. And I don't remember which conversation this was, but I know it was Richie who said it. Uh, when you are speaking to someone that has a traditionally female name, you want to pair female pronouns with it.
I
Like
think he,
your
I think
your
he
brain does
mentioned
that.
I think he mentioned that in his one of his essays too. The "Where's the line" one.
Possibly. I
I
think
think he might
I
have
think
talked about.
he mentioned it again on it was I think it was a chatting. He might have been chatting with you. I can't remember, but it was very recently that I remember watching that saying, oh no, maybe it was with Genevieve Gluck. Yeah. Um, so when he was talking to Redux, I think that's when it was very recently talking about how they're using traditionally female names and your brain makes that mental shortcut to put in
Mm-hmm.
a female pronoun. And that's what it's been doing for me. And as I've been saying for a really long time, I don't like forcing myself to use pronouns, even if like, even doesn't matter whether it's sex based or like a preferred pronoun. I don't like trying to rewire my brain. I just feel like it's too much work for me. And you spend 10 years freaking out about pronouns. You don't really want to freak out about pronouns anymore. Um, but they're they're weaponizing that. They use that. So
Yeah.
if you accept that you're a man, but you're using a female name, and you know that you want people to use a certain pronoun, and you want people to recognize that you're making an effort, and because there's a few people that keep saying that I'm making an effort to look a certain way, and people are rewarding them for doing that basically by helping them dissociate from their bodies, dissociate from reality, and help them live in sort of this idea that they're the opposite sex when they're not. It's just, it's not helping, and it comes across as it's hypocritical. I know I'm a man, but also call me by a female name, and
Well,
I'm going to keep wearing
here's the thing.
dresses.
If you know you're a
Yeah,
man, then why are you trying to, like, quote unquote, be a woman? Like, what is the point
that's the
here?
whole
What?
thing.
And here's the other thing. It's too. It's like, uh, why are you trying to blend in with the opposite sex that you are not? Like, it makes no sense to transition and then not kind of be stealth, not go in those spaces, not use that kind of realm of existence of the opposite sex or the sex you want to be.
Hmm.
Because then what is the point? There's no point to it.
There's none. There's I think what they would say, I'm trying to think of how they might like sort of I'm trying to steel man the argument basically. It's just sort of what would they say? I think they would say because it lessens my own personal distress to look the way that I currently look. That's
So
what
then
I
why
think
don't
that's what they would say.
so why not just look like that and not medically change anything, or not change your name or go by a different name or use different pronouns or allow
Right.
people to use different pronouns? Like, it's they're lying. It's just all
Yeah.
there is to it.
I I'm trying to steel man the argument, but I don't think that the argument is a good argument.
Yeah.
I think they need to do some exposure therapy, essentially. Is that
Yeah.
you need
Yeah.
to try to detransition. Some of them have, I think and not anyone that I can think of like that's sort of like well known, but I know that I've spoken to people before that say, well, I tried detransitioning before and it didn't help, so I went back.
Help
And
what though? That's the problem. You talk about this. You don't believe in transsexual, and you don't even believe in the whole gender dysphoria really thing. And I'm totally with you there. I don't like using that word because it masks what you're really trying to talk about. It's just this big encompassing thing. It's basically gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is don't question me.
mhm,
I have gender dysphoria. Don't question me. Because
yep,
if you ask, well, what is that? What? Don't tell me gender dysphoria. Tell me what you're feeling and thinking. You're going to get much more to the root of what's happening with someone if they do that. But people don't want to do that because that would be too honest and too painful.
that's conversion therapy.
Yeah, well, I mean,
You can't ask questions.
the other thing that boggles my mind is how they can sit there. and say things like it saved my life, it worked for me, blah 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 blah. Yet this treatment literally almost killed them.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, wait a minute, you are medically poisoning yourself. You are slowly killing yourself with this. Yet this is life saving. It is such this like if you want to know if a trans if you want to know the truth of trans, just flip it. Whatever they say, just do the opposite. That's what it really is doing.
Mhm.
My true self, it's not the true self.
Life saving,
Life
life
saving,
ruining.
it's not life saving, it's life destroying. You know. Um, I like that you touched on the trans away the gay thing in here
Yes. I
because
felt like that
that
was really important just because so many of the quote unquote good ones, so many of them are gay. They're same sex
yes
attracted. And we're out here putting these people forward as like the good ones, as the ones that it worked for when they're
right.
gay. Like we're saying that conversion surgery was good for them.
Oh yeah, good for them. So why isn't it good for me?
Yeah.
That's my that's I'm at this point. That's my question. Okay, it was good for you and it worked for you. Why didn't it work for me? Can someone answer that?
Hmm. And there are certain detransitioners whom speaking to them and finding out that they had stories that are so similar to the true trans people, they were the ones that actually like really, really piqued me. And there is someone in specific, hello, I'm sure he's gonna watch this, but like, but like, it because it's so similar. It just that when I said earlier, I said sometime earlier this year, I said I peaked again. I peaked a second
Mm,
time, and it was starting to talk to people and realizing there is literally no difference. I said it in there that I feel like my story is very much social influence.
mhm.
So I was like, okay, well, if I was socially influenced, maybe there are people who aren't socially influenced. And these are people who were not socially influenced, who transitioned, who lived stealth, and then detransitioned because it was all bullshit. And if they can say that it's all bullshit, even though these are the people it was supposed to have worked for, then how am I ever going to square that it works for anyone else? It just doesn't make any more sense. That's it.
And I've always said too, um, that the most true transsexual is always a homosexual.
Yep.
You ever notice that? It's even going all the way back to Mr. Harry Benjamin. Harry Benjamin's firmest belief in the real transsexual was the effeminate gay man.
Yes.
Because Harry Benjamin's standards was do you act like a woman? Can you
Right.
act like a woman? What the fuck does that even mean? Well,
And that includes being attracted to men. Yeah, it
yeah,
was it was really
yeah.
homophobic.
So I
I'm
mean,
I was gonna
yeah, I
say
mean,
I'm reading David Rymer's story. So this is the twins
oh,
that John Money. Yeah, it's horrifying. I'm very early on, but they are talking about background and stuff like that. And John Money had sort of that same thing where he thought that gender was like actually a social construct that you are born with your gender is undifferentiated basically when you're born, and however you raise the child is what gender they're going to be, and that included being attracted to the opposite sex. So when he reassigned, well, his name was Bruce Rymer before when he was a baby. When they reassigned him to Brenda, he said, "When you raise Brenda, she is going to be attracted to men." That was part of it. Was that
mm.
she will be attracted to men when she grows up, and then will be able to have regular relations. But he wasn't because he was a straight man.
No, and plus that would have never happened because there's no surgery that can ever give you genitalia that will ever fucking function. So like,
Yep.
how do you have a normal relationship without that? Beats me.
Yeah. Quote unquote
Um,
normal.
but yeah, I really the gay thing is definitely one of those things. It's just like, wait, you're all talking about how the kids are being trans the gay away, but like the adults are they're transing the gay away too, if not doing it to themselves, but the society as a whole, the doctors and everything are also doing this. You cannot hold up the gay man who said it worked for him or the gay woman who said it worked for her and then tell the kids no, or say, oh well, kids, oh no, you're going to trans the gay away with kids. with adults? I don't know, just such a separation. It's like, no,
There's a
not.
lot of that going around where people
It's
are like, well, the kids, but the adults, it's not as bad if it's their choice. It's still bad. It's still bad.
it's still bad, and they can make that choice. But the thing is, like I said, you cannot make a choice when it comes to medical interventions,
Mhm.
right? We don't make choices. Medical interventions are gate kept. That is the whole fucking purpose. You should have a test if you're going to cut people's bodies off and cut parts of people's bodies off and poison their endocrine system and poison the reproductive system. You better have a good fucking test that shows that that person has this condition so extreme that you must shorten their lifespan in order to treat this extreme condition.
Yep.
There's no such
And
thing exists.
yep. And people have no problem applying that to children, but for whatever reason, they can't apply it to adults. So, like, and it makes sense. Again, it makes sense because children are vulnerable, but it's the same test. It's the same test that you're using for children. You better have a really good reason. And, that's why suicide gets weaponized. Because
Yeah,
the only reason you would ever do something like that is if someone's going to die,
right?
because it doesn't make sense to do it in any other situation. And because there's no data that's actually showing that it is saving anyone's lives, as soon as people start actually admitting that, because the data is there, and eventually this is gonna come to a head where people are like, well, the data wasn't ever really there. So,
No,
like, when
it
that comes
wasn't.
out, we're all gonna be like, then why were we doing this? And, quote unquote, start thinking of why you supported sterilizing children.
So I another thing I was like, wow, I that's an interesting take is when you basically were doing the whole talk back to say one of the true transsexuals, quote unquote, who would say, well, what would you have me do?
Mm-hmm.
And you were like,
Detransition, basically.
what?
And a detransition,
Oh,
basically, but like the way I didn't say detransition in there on purpose. I
uh-huh.
said, this is what you need to do. Because you don't necessarily have to stop medicating, I don't think. Because there are people who have desisted in their minds who are still medicating because they feel like they have to. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but like, change your name. Go. You don't even have to legally change it. Go buy a different name. Um, go buy a name that was either your old name, or go buy a name that is associated with your sex, or go buy a unisex name. Even, like, just stop trying to mimic the other that sex. That's the whole thing. Stop
Yeah.
trying to deceive people about your sex.
Well, stop
that's
lying.
that's yeah,
Basically,
that's it.
stop lying.
And
um,
the name and the pronouns is lying. It's part of the lying, and they don't want to admit that it's part of the lying.
I mean, I do understand that there are some cases where hormone wise, the individual might actually physically do better at that point on the opposite sex hormone just because they are all harmful and sometimes you have to pick the least harmful once like your own reproductive organs has been removed, so I get that.
Yeah.
And also again, it's not it's it, the damage has been done, so it's now you're just trying to have to manage the damage as best you can, so I get that, but the lying part is the problem, right?
Yes. I don't think this is necessarily a behind the scenes conversation, but have heard a lot of these sort of like quote unquote GC transsexuals say, specifically the ones that are female, they have said that they are trying to be on the lowest dose of testosterone possible, which I think, it suggests that they realize that they are harming themselves. But they still don't want to admit that they're harming themselves. If they're changing their dose of testosterone to try and save their health, they know to some degree this is not healthy for me.
that
So,
um some things are black and white.
yeah.
Your whole premise has been for a really long time, nuance, that maybe you can't no black maybe black and white thinking is not the best thing, but then, and I'll quote, sometimes the truth isn't nuanced and sometimes it is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I like that.
it was uncomfortable for me even. I mean, that is the reason I didn't say it sooner, is I had a lot of relationships with people, I guess, like friendships, not close friendships, but just, casual friendships with a lot of the people that I'm criticizing in this
Yeah.
piece. So deciding to post it, there were people. Remember, I said a couple of people retweeted it, and those are the people that I cared about more than the other ones. So the fact that it went over well with them is positive to me. Um, but there were other people, and I'm sure that there are relationships now that are never gonna be repaired because of that. And it was sort of this realization that you have to say things that are uncomfortable if you believe that they are true.
Yeah.
And I really, I think that's the whole purpose of the whole movement, is we have to say things that are uncomfortable for people if they are the truth. So
Yeah. I think,
yeah.
yeah, I think when it comes to, if we're trying to change something, if we're trying to bring back sanity and truth and fact, I don't see how there's room for trans or transition to be in that conversation at all. They need to be, maybe they'd have their own conversation somewhere else, but they cannot be in the group that's trying to turn back some of this tide. It just doesn't make any sense.
hmm like and when I present this, I try and present it as, this is my opinion that we should not be doing this strategy, and I can't force anyone to also go along with the strategy. But I think one of the reasons that this was effective, and the fact that so many people have been sharing it, is because I also went through transition, and a lot of this isn't often said by people who have went through transition. You said it, Richie has said it. I know there are other people who have said things that are similar to this. Um, but when it comes from someone who has gone through it, I think it has that extra weight. But I also there's also the fact that it the people that it alienates, trying to be moderate by including them, I think they were okay. The moderates were okay with the fact that most of them were radical feminists. The people that they're alienating are radical feminists. They were
Mhm.
okay with that, the moderate orgs. And this isn't necessarily me speaking about anything that I know, but I'm just sort of off the top of my head, sort of, this is how I think it is. I think that they were okay with the fact that those are the people that we're alienating. They're like, okay, that's acceptable because, this is an extremist side that we can just sort of ignore, you know? But if it comes to detransitioners, and a detransitioner comes in and says, I can't work with these people because they're saying shit that is interfering with my recovery. And if you care about detransitioners, then are you going to alienate us? And I think that's where we're getting it. That's where it's becoming effective, is the fact that, well, are you going to be okay with alienating all the detransitioners by saying, well, actually, transition is right for some people. And I think people are going to realize, no, we can't keep saying that, actually.
No.
So,
Yeah, and it is super alienating. It was something that kind of, like, out the gate when I first started to be kind of public and did an interview. Did an interview with a particular podcast, and then 2 days or 3 days later, like their next couple podcasts after mine, a very happy transsexual came on to talk about all her happy transsexual things, and I just was like, that hit weird. And I was like, but I didn't understand why it hit weird at the time. And it's taken me some time to figure it out. But
mhm,
now I'm here and I'm like, nope, it's not acceptable. It's self harm. It's bullshit. It's a lie. I have a zero tolerance policy for it, you know?
yeah,
And just look at the damage, not just me, not just my little realm, the whole fucking, like, world. Look at all the damage that's been done because people want to live this huge fucking lie. I mean, just women's spaces alone, and in the effect of kids in schools. It's just, not to mention all the people who've been medicalized.
yeah. Something that comes to mind that been wanting to mention throughout this is something that like really, really rubbed me the wrong way was that when I was in Denver, we had a meeting, me and some other people, one of the other orgs that I was part of that I haven't named. We had a meeting with people who are trying to start, they're trying to start something medical for detransitioners, essentially. So they're like trying to start medical services that are specific to detransitioners. And I was with a group, and in the group included transsexuals. So I think I was the only detransitioner there. And in that sort of like just there was sort of like a little round table where we all introduced ourselves, and like one of the people was like, "Oh yeah, I'm one of the people that transition worked for." We are at a table. We are talking about detransition and how detransitioners have been harmed, and we have a transsexual at the table going off about how transition worked for her. Like it
That is,
rubbed me the wrong way so badly. I was like, really? Like, and just I'm sorry, but transsexuals should never be involved in anything to do with detransitioners ever.
it's a slap
Ever.
in the face, is what it is. It's an absolute fucking slap in the face. And it makes me think that no one was listening to anything any of us had to say.
Yeah, this same person pulled the personal responsibility line on me later. So
Oh,
I'm
you
yeah, this
fuck off
particular
with that
person
shit.
I'm very pissed at. So
Responsible. Oh my God.
yeah,
Anyways, so yeah, it's good to have you on this side of the canal.
yeah. I try not to pick sides. So one of the TRAs that like he didn't even like reblog me. Like he just took screenshots of my article and posted them. So what happened was in this he said something about, oh, like your new political identity isn't going to help you more than your old political identity, blah blah blah. And the thing is, I haven't changed political identities. I changed my mind on one thing. I changed my, and it wasn't even changing it that much, because ever since I've arrived on the scene, I've always thought there are adults being harmed by this. The only
Yeah.
thing that I changed was there are some adults, a very tiny amount of adults that it's working for, and I switched to thinking, actually, no, there aren't. There are zero adults that it's working for. That is not that big of a switch, to be honest. Um, so I don't think that I've actually moved all that much. I think I just changed, like, just some in terms of strategy. I've
I
changed.
I guess the feeling I get is you finally got fed up and you're like, okay, look, no, here's a line. Just no. That's I think that's
It was enough being yanked around by people being all like, well, you were an adult, so maybe it's not as bad. And it was really, it just really downplays everything that we have gone through as adults who transition.
I think it's taken some years to get to this point, but like now I know the focus, I understand what my focus is, and really my focus is that this is medical malpractice.
Yes.
This is what I'm advocating against. I'm advocating against medical malpractice. And it's happened to me, many and you and many people I know, and continues to happen. Whether the person is happy with their medical malpractice or not, or
Yes.
the medical malpractice being done to them or not, it's beside the point. I don't happiness has nothing to do with this. Let's not talk
Yes.
about that anymore.
Yep. No. And I think I've been somewhere in that line the whole time. My whole thing the entire time has been, we need to follow the evidence. We need to follow the evidence. We need to look at the evidence. We got to look at the science. Because the science, there's no, I'm going to say quote unquote the science. Don't say the
Yeah.
science, but because the science is never settled. Science is never settled.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the existing studies, there's nothing proving that you can be born in the wrong body. So
Yeah.
there's no male brain in a female body or vice versa. That doesn't exist. There's studies that are trying to prove it, but none of them are controlling for homosexuality. None of them are controlling, well, not none of them, but when they do, it shows that homosexual brains are shifted, heterosexual brains are not. So what we're looking at is not trans brains, we're looking at gay brains. Like what we found is there's actually a difference in gay brains. There's not a difference in straight brains. And, so that's not proving that trans exists. And then, or they don't control for hormones.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe your brain has changed because you literally had exogenous hormones pumped into your body.
Exactly.
So none of these studies are proving that once you start controlling for things like that. So if that doesn't exist, that is the one thing that everything falls apart on. And I think the other argument we can say is, is there something different in brains of people who are dysphoric instead of saying people who have a brain in the wrong body? And I think that the neuroscience around that is that they show that it is very similar to eating disorders.
Yeah.
So it's the same area of the brain that's affected. It reflects how you see yourself. So that's not there might be like a condition that causes that to happen, but I think it's more like body dysmorphia than gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
So
Well, again, that's why I mean, just throw out gender dysphoria and talk about what you're talking about.
exactly. Yeah.
I also like how you kind of like you summed up. You're just like with the transsexuals, you're like go stealth,
Yeah.
shut up. Basically, you're like don't say anything, don't put yourself in there. Like if you like they don't recognize that this is a problem. They don't recognize that this is unhealthy and that this is hurting people. Obviously, because if they did, they'd be like, I know I'm doing this thing and I know it's not the greatest, but it's the only way I can function, but I don't really want other people to go through this. Like when I was trans identified, I kind of had that feeling, right? I was against child transition when I was still trans identified because after starting to go through the process, I went, no way, kids should not go through this at all. This is fucking rough. The hormones and stuff like that. But I guess it's kind of like I wouldn't want people I cared about or anybody to do something that I was doing to cope that I knew was self-destructive. I wouldn't want other people to do that.
Mhm.
Um I've heard stories of, like drug addicts who have hidden it and then, when they find out someone they care about is doing drugs too, they're just like, God damn it, no, like don't do this shit. You do it. I know, but it's bad. Don't do it. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
that thing. Um, but this is not what they're doing. What they're doing is it worked for me, it's great. But
Yeah.
it's
It's
like
advertising.
that's
And
the other thing too that I talk about, like all trans all trans there's a whole cult aspect to it too, and I don't think you can separate that out, right? Because it almost demands that because you're living a lie and because you have to twist so much reality to exist, you have to reach out and twist that reality, and that means twisting people, and that means making people do things that, what, they might not be comfortable with, and so it mandates that you become, a prophet of sorts and spread the good word. It's just it seems like I'll do it.
like it's part of the denial having to and I think part of it is sunk costs. Like I can think about all of the reasons why I didn't detransition sooner. And I think those are the reasons that they have as well. And those reasons could carry you forever. It's the sunk costs. It's the fact that if you detransition, you are uprooting your whole life. Maybe not the whole thing, but like you're going by you're going by a completely different name. Not everyone changes their name after. Um, Usually you're going by a completely different name. You're asking people to change how they see you a second time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Doing it also means that you are admitting to literally every single person who has ever known you that you made a giant ass mistake. And you spent however many years insisting that it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's humiliating. It's
It
humbling
is.
and it's
It really.
humiliating. So like of course people aren't doing it. And the same when people are all like, oh, why aren't there more public detransitioners? Because it's humiliating.
Mm-hmm.
I did an entire video comparing it to being on the Jerry Springer show. You're being paraded out like a freak show. Like, of
Yeah.
course, people aren't going to go public and say, well, I did this thing, especially if you're an adult. Because if you're an adult, you're going to get every single time someone shares my story, there are multiple people being all like, she was an adult. she made those choices, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just like, medical malpractice happens to adults too.
Mm-hmm.
Here it is. And so, who wants that? Who wants thousands of people talking about you as if they know you? Who wants all these people victim blaming you? Nobody wants that. Of course, there aren't more public
And
detransition. I don't
and
think
the other,
anyone should go public. By the way, don't go public.
yeah, don't go public. At least till you've had a good long time and know what your goal is with it too. Um, so that reminds me of what you said in here too that I thought was amazing. You talked about how if the detransitioner seems super unstable, but the trans identified person seems stable, well, it's because the detransitioner is literally uprooted their lives, like you just said. They are going through this whole change. They are facing reality. It is a brutal process. So yeah, we're going to be kind of fucked up for a while. Like that's, you know,
Yeah,
whereas the transsexual is still living the dream.
even like the transsexuals in the movement make it look good, and that's part of
Yeah.
the advertising is that they make it look good, but it's not good. Like, it's sort of, I know people on social media, for example, who their social media is very curated. And if you looked at their Instagram, for example, you would never think that anything horrible was happening in their lives, ever. But if you knew them behind the scenes, that their lives are not perfect at all. And in fact, sometimes they're actually falling apart. That's pretty much, it's the exact same thing. Is that they're making it seem like, and it's not even just them, it's really just every trans influencer ever, all saying, oh yeah, everything's great. And all the way back to way back when I transitioned 2010, there were, for example, women on testosterone posting videos being all like, I'm 1 month on testosterone, I'm 2 months on. And they talked about things. They very rarely ever talked about things that were going wrong for them. Because nobody really wants to talk about that bit. They kind of think in their heads, oh, things might be going wrong now, but that's because I'm still in the beginning process. And then
Yeah.
you just
No,
keep going further.
instead of no, it's only going to get worse.
Yep.
I think that's kind of one of the main takeaways, or the main point I try to make when I talk about this is I try to focus on the medical harm that's happening because you can't. That is a fact, right? That is a hard fact that
It's objective.
this is damaging. Yes, you can take everything, strip everything else away, and what we do know is that taking in putting cross sex hormones or wrong sex hormones in your body to such fucking high levels are not supposed to be is poison. It is poisoning your body. And removing healthy body parts is damaging. There's no reason to get rid of. And many of these parts that are removed, like say the uterus, does more than just make babies, right? It holds up the bladder. It does a whole bunch of stuff in there that you will have problems after this.
It has effects on your brain, even.
Yes.
Just the uterus being in there has effects on your brain. It's the risk for dementia goes up by a certain amount if you have a hysterectomy. Even if you keep the ovaries, it's higher if you get rid of the ovaries as well. But even I have my ovaries still. But just taking the uterus out affects your brain, and I don't remember anyone telling me that. I don't remember anyone saying, that the uterus has structural purpose also.
Yes.
If you take it out, then there's a possibility that the inside is going to come out. It's going to prolapse. So
talk to any woman who's had one and they've had a problem. It's not without problems.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this was a great article, or essay, whatever you want to refer to it as. And I hope people read it and get what we're trying to say. And I feel like you wrote down perfectly and articulated everything that I've been thinking about and been saying. But like you, now I've been told I'm a good writer, and I am, but I don't like to write. So yeah, so I don't write. You're only a good writer if you actually write. But I appreciate your work as a writer, just like Richie does a lot of good writing too. I think it's awesome that you guys are around doing the writing. And yeah, thanks for coming on this my channel, talking to me about it. And yeah, is there any final thoughts you have? Anything you want to say before we say see you later?
Not really, except I appreciate it, and I have so many positive comments about my writing in the last 3 days that I'm extremely overwhelmed by it, including from like people who are literally like my intellectual crushes. So
Mm.
just hearing that from people that I respect so much has been amazing. It's especially the people who have said that they read it and that it changed their thinking. That's always what I'm trying to do is change people's thinking, just give a different perspective and then think, I had never thought about it that way. This is a new way to think about it.
Yeah.
Um, that's always what I've wanted to do with my writing. And I feel like a lot of people said I did it really well with this one. So
All right. So thank you so much.
no problem. Thank you.